What's the hardest family conversation you've never had?
She looked me straight in the eye across the dinner table and said, with that calm finality that only a mother can deliver, that I would never be as beautiful or as accomplished as my sister. As if it were a fact written somewhere in stone, and she was simply reminding me of it, so I wouldn't get any foolish ideas about competing. The room went quiet for a moment, though my sister gave a little smile. Not the comforting kind, but the smug one that says she was in on the judgment, enjoying it the way she always enjoyed seeing me put in my place. I wanted to respond, to say something sharp or even cruel, but instead I smiled, excused myself to clear the dishes, and kept my silence, because I knew that nothing I said in that moment would matter, not to them. I washed those dishes like I'd washed them 1,000 times before, carrying the same weight I had carried since I was a teenager, the weight of being less than. I drove home with the words echoing in my head, not because they were new, but because of how ordinary they felt, how routine, as if this was the rhythm of our family. One daughter praised, the other dismissed, and a mother who believed she was simply telling the truth. I thought about how, for years, I had been told that I should be grateful just to be part of a family where someone was shining, as if my sister's accomplishments were a gift I should bask in rather than a reminder of everything I supposedly lacked. I lay in bed that night thinking not so much about what my mother had said, but about the look on my sister's face when she said it, that small, satisfied grin, like the crown had been placed on her head again, and I had been sent to the corner where I belonged. The phone rang the next morning, early enough that my first thought was that something serious had happened. It was my sister, and she didn't sound composed the way she usually does, with that confident, almost rehearsed voice she uses whenever she talks about work or her latest plans. Instead, she sounded frantic, her words rushing together, her breathing uneven. She told me that Mom was shaking, that she didn't know what was wrong, that she was scared. I sat there holding the phone, listening to her panic, and for a long second I didn't answer because I couldn't help thinking about the irony. Less than 12 hours earlier, I was the unworthy one, the spare part of the family, and now the perfect sister was calling me in desperation because suddenly Mom wasn't the unshakable pillar she had always been. I asked what she meant by shaking, and she said Mom had been in the kitchen making coffee when her hands began trembling so badly that the cup nearly shattered on the floor, and she couldn't seem to control it. Her whole body unsteady as if something inside her had broken overnight. My sister's voice kept rising, and I could hear the edge of fear in it, the same sister who had always seemed so sure of herself now unable to hold it together. I could almost picture her face, wide-eyed, maybe finally realizing that she wasn't as invincible as she liked to believe. I wanted to rush over, or at least part of me thought that's what I should do, but another part of me remembered every dinner where I had been compared, every holiday where my accomplishments were brushed aside like crumbs from the table, every time I was made to feel like the afterthought. And so instead of immediately offering help, I sat there quietly, asking questions in a calm, measured voice, making her repeat herself, stretching out the moment. She kept saying, "What happened? What did you do? She was fine last night. What happened?" As if somehow I had the answer, as if my silence at the dinner table had been more than silence. It was strange, hearing that edge of accusation in her voice, almost like she suspected me of something, and for once I didn't rush to defend myself. I didn't scramble to prove I had nothing to do with it. I let the silence stretch, because it felt like for the first time in my life, she needed something from me more than I needed anything from her, and I wasn't about to waste that feeling by handing her comfort too quickly. By the time I finally said I'd come by, her panic had already settled into suspicion, and she repeated again, almost whispering this time, "What happened?" like she wanted to pull some hidden confession out of me. I hung up before I could answer, my heart pounding, not because I had done anything not yet, but because I realized she believed I might have, and the thought of her fearing me, even a little, was intoxicating in a way I had never felt before. That morning I drove back toward the house I had left less than a day earlier, the words my mother had spoken still hanging in the air like unfinished business. I wasn't sure yet what I was walking into, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. For once, I wasn't the one on the defensive anymore, and that shift, however small, was enough to make me wonder just how far I could push it if I chose to. And that was the first time I caught myself thinking, not just about surviving their insults, but about what it might look like to finally turn the tables. When I walked back into that house the next morning, the one I had left less than 12 hours earlier after scrubbing dishes and swallowing the kind of insult that never really leaves your bones, I noticed immediately that the atmosphere was not the usual carefully maintained calm that my mother insisted on keeping, the one where my sister was always shown as the polished success story and I was simply tolerated. But instead it was cracked wide open with my sister pacing, her voice breaking as she tried to explain what had happened while my mother sat in the chair looking smaller than I had ever seen her hands still trembling like they were no longer under her command. My sister, always the confident one, the one who never lost her cool even in college when she had professors fawning over her work, was suddenly unable to string a full sentence together without stumbling, which was almost disorienting to witness because the dynamic had been so fixed for so long that I couldn't remember a time when I wasn't the one tripping over words while she held the spotlight effortlessly. She kept demanding answers from me, asking whether I had noticed anything strange the night before, whether Mom had seemed ill or distracted, and though she tried to frame it like genuine concern, I could hear that edge in her tone. The same edge she had when she used to interrogate me as a teenager about where I was going or why I hadn't tried harder in school. The tone that wasn't about helping but about cornering. I wanted to laugh, though I didn't, because here she was, the golden child, reduced to guessing in the dark while asking me, of all people, to shed some light, which made me feel something I hadn't felt in years: power, faint but unmistakable. I sat down across from my mother, who still couldn't hold a cup without spilling water onto the carpet, and instead of rushing in with reassurance or panicked energy, I asked her quietly what she thought was happening, which made her eyes flicker toward me in a way that was different from the dismissive glances I was used to, as though she were suddenly seeing me as someone she might need, someone she couldn't afford to belittle, and for once the silence that followed was not mine but hers. My sister jumped in again, cutting me off before Mom could answer, and started rattling off possibilities she had pulled from the internet in the last hour: medical conditions and dietary causes, as if reciting knowledge could fill the void of control that was slipping through her hands. I watched her, this woman who had always been framed as flawless, spiral into frantic rambling, and I felt the tiniest spark of satisfaction because I had been there before, dozens of times, begging to be heard. While she and Mom dismissed me, and now, for the first time, she was the one not being heard. Of course, there was a part of me that wanted to reach for compassion, to remember that this was my family and that something genuinely frightening might be happening, but every time I tried to lean in that direction, I heard my mother's words from the night before echoing in my head like a bell I couldn't unring: "You will never be as beautiful or as accomplished as your sister." That single sentence became the lens through which I viewed the entire scene, and it hardened me in a way I had not expected, because I realized that maybe my mother's shaking wasn't just physical, maybe it was something deeper. Some crack forming in the carefully constructed story of our family, and I was the only one standing still enough to see it clearly. When the doorbell rang and the neighbor came in, having been called by my sister in her panic, I let her take over with her concerned questions and offers to drive Mom to the hospital. But I noticed something my sister didn't: the way Mom's eyes darted to me again. Just for a second, like she was worried about what I might say, as though she thought I knew something she had kept hidden, something that wasn't about her health, but about the balance of control in this family. And in that moment, I knew she was right to worry, because as I sat there, silent but steady, I realized I did have something, a memory I hadn't thought about in years. Something I had stumbled on back in high school when I overheard a late-night phone call that was never meant for my ears, and though I hadn't used it then, because I was too young and too desperate to hold the family together, the weight of it had never left me. I didn't reveal it, not yet, because timing matters more than truth, and if there's one lesson I've learned being the overlooked daughter, it's that silence, when used properly, can be louder than any argument. So instead, I watched as my sister hustled around the kitchen, making phone calls, trying to control what couldn't be controlled, while my mother sat trembling and avoided my gaze. And I decided right then that I was going to stop being the one who absorbed insults and kept the peace. I wasn't going to scream or throw accusations, but I was going to start playing my own game, slowly and carefully, until the two of them realized that the daughter they thought was powerless had been sitting with more leverage than they could imagine. When I finally stood to leave, my sister snapped at me, asking how I could walk away when Mom was like this, and I told her in the calmest voice I could manage that maybe she should handle it since she was the accomplished one. And for a split second I saw the shock on her face before she masked it with irritation, but I knew the seed had been planted. And as I walked out the door, I thought about how one small secret from the past, combined with the cracks now showing in the present, might be enough to rewrite everything they thought they knew about me, and I smiled to myself because for the first time, I wasn't just reacting. I was planning. When I woke up the next morning, I realized that something inside me had shifted in a way that was not loud or dramatic, but steady and undeniable. As though I had crossed an invisible line from being the person who was always absorbing what others handed me into the person who was finally ready to decide what happened next. And that realization made me sit up in bed with a clarity I had not felt in years, maybe not ever. I kept replaying the look in my mother's eyes the day before, that flicker of fear when she realized that I might know something she would rather stay buried, and the desperation in my sister's voice as she demanded I explain what had happened, both of which told me that the balance of power had shifted ever so slightly, and though I had not yet made a move, I already knew they were unsettled simply because I had chosen not to play the role they expected. All morning I thought about that secret I had kept locked away since high school, the one I overheard when my mother was on the phone late at night, her voice low but sharp, telling someone that if she ever found out, the family's reputation would be destroyed. At the time I had no idea who she was, but the way my mother's tone cut through the silence of the house told me it was serious, and when I later pieced together fragments, whispered conversations about money that had gone missing, a friendship that ended abruptly, and the way my mother avoided one particular neighbor for years, I began to realize that there had been more going on than the spotless image she presented to the world. I had carried that knowledge with me, never quite sure if I was imagining connections that weren't there, but when I saw her trembling yesterday, unable to steady her hands while darting nervous glances in my direction, I knew she remembered too, and that she knew I hadn't forgotten. My sister called again mid-morning, her voice brisk, trying to sound like she had taken control, telling me that she was scheduling doctor's appointments and making lists of possible causes. But beneath the surface of her words I could hear the same thin thread of panic, because no matter how organized she sounded, she still didn't know what was happening, and it terrified her. She asked if I was coming back over, and I told her I had things to do, which made her stumble for a moment, because she was so used to me being the one available, the one willing to bend, that my refusal sounded foreign to her. I let the silence stretch after that, because I knew it would eat at her, the uncertainty of whether I was withholding something, and in truth I was, though not in the way she suspected. That afternoon I decided to test just how unsettled they were, so I drove to my mother's house unannounced, walked in without knocking, and found them sitting together at the kitchen table. My mother pale but still trembling, and my sister leaning forward with her phone in hand, as if she had been documenting every symptom, like she was preparing a case study. When they looked up and saw me, there was a strange stillness, as though they had been talking about me before I walked in, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel smaller under their gaze, but larger, because I knew that whatever story they had been telling themselves was already cracking. I sat down slowly and asked my mother how she was feeling, not with the tone of a daughter begging for approval, but with the steady voice of someone who knew more than she was saying, and she blinked rapidly before insisting she was fine, which made my sister jump in again, explaining that the tremors were still bad and demanding I stop, acting like everything was normal. It was almost too easy to let the silence linger before I leaned back in my chair and said casually that sometimes stress has a way of catching up with people, especially when they've been holding on to things for too long. And the way both of them froze told me the words had landed exactly where I wanted them to. My sister snapped, asking what I meant, but I shrugged it off and changed the subject, leaving her frustrated and my mother even paler than before, and in that moment I understood the real value of the secret I carried. It wasn't the details themselves that mattered, it was the fact that they knew I had something I could use, and that not knowing when or how I might use it was enough to make them squirm. Over the next hour, I watched the dynamic shift in ways so subtle they might have gone unnoticed if I hadn't been paying attention. My sister, usually the one directing every conversation, kept glancing at me like she was trying to decode my expression, and my mother, who for years had spoken with the kind of authority that could flatten me in seconds, kept her answers short and careful, as though any wrong word might give me an opening. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't accuse anyone of anything, but the weight of what I didn't say pressed on them harder than anything I could have spoken, and for the first time, I realized just how much strength there is in restraint. When I finally stood up to leave, my sister demanded that I promise to come back later, that I not abandon them when Mom was like this. And I looked her in the eye and told her that maybe it was her turn to carry the weight, since she was the one Mom always said could handle anything. The words hung there for a long moment, heavier than I expected, and I could see my mother's lips tremble, though not from the shaking this time, but from the truth she didn't want to acknowledge. I walked out of that house knowing I had just taken my first real step in a plan I hadn't fully shaped yet, but could already see taking form, and the strange thing was that I didn't feel guilty or conflicted, only clear. Because after years of being told I was less, I had finally discovered that being underestimated can be the sharpest weapon of all. By the time the weekend arrived, my sister had organized a small family gathering under the pretense that Mom needed normalcy, routine, and familiar company. Though I knew perfectly well that what she really wanted was to reassert control over a situation that had slipped from her fingers the moment Mom's hands began to shake and her composure cracked in front of me. She sent out messages to a few relatives, arranged a dinner, and insisted that I come, not as a polite invitation, but as a demand phrased in the kind of clipped tone she used when she wanted me to remember my place. For years I would have bent to that tone without argument, would have shown up quietly and accepted whatever role was handed to me, but this time I felt something different moving through me. A quiet certainty that I didn't need to play the obedient daughter or the invisible sister any longer, because the secret I carried and the fear I had seen in their eyes had already begun shifting the balance, and all I had to do was use the opportunity to let it break wide open. When I arrived, the room was buzzing with the usual small talk, relatives chatting about work, health, and the predictable details that fill these kinds of evenings, but beneath that hum of conversation there was a current of unease, at least for me. Because I could feel the way my sister's eyes followed me, sharp and calculating, as though she expected me to slip up or reveal something she could seize upon. My mother sat at the head of the table, pale and quieter than usual, her hands still trembling enough that she held her glass with both palms, and though the others tried to pretend not to notice, I could see their concern growing. My sister kept intercepting questions, answering on Mom's behalf with that bright, authoritative voice that she always used when she wanted to take command of the narrative, but the cracks showed when she glanced nervously toward me, waiting for me to challenge her version of events. For most of the dinner, I said very little, letting them stew in the silence of my restraint, because silence, I had learned, was not weakness but pressure, and every time I chose not to jump in, I could feel them shifting in their seats, waiting for what I might say. Finally, when my aunt asked me directly how Mom seemed when I saw her earlier in the week, I leaned back in my chair, looked straight at my mother, and said that sometimes when people carry secrets for too long, the body finds a way to let the truth leak out, even when the mouth refuses to. The table went quiet instantly, forks paused midair, and I watched my mother's face go rigid while my sister's mouth fell open before she quickly forced a smile and tried to laugh it off, insisting I always had a flair for the dramatic. But the unease had already landed, and everyone could feel it. I didn't elaborate, I didn't explain, I didn't raise my voice, because I knew that ambiguity was sharper than accusation, and by leaving my words hanging in the air, I gave everyone at the table permission to fill in the blanks with their own suspicions. My sister tried to redirect, talking about her latest promotion and the recognition she was receiving at work, slipping back into the role of the golden child as though rehearsed. But the timing was all wrong, because instead of admiration, what she received were distracted nods from relatives who were still watching Mom, still wondering what I meant, still turning over the phrase "secrets carried too long" in their heads. As dessert was served, my sister leaned toward me and whispered sharply that if I wanted attention, I could at least have the decency not to make Mom look bad in front of family, and I smiled at her. The kind of smile she used to give me when she had just outshone me again, and I whispered back that maybe she should be more worried about what Mom had been hiding than about me, because the truth has a way of surfacing when you least expect it. Her face went pale for a second, and though she quickly recovered, I saw the flicker of panic, the same panic I had heard in her voice on the phone when she called me about Mom shaking, and I knew I had struck exactly where I needed to. The beauty of it was that I still hadn't said anything concrete, hadn't revealed a single detail of what I remembered, but by planting the suggestion in front of the entire family, I had shifted the focus away from my supposed inadequacies and onto my mother's silence, forcing her to either deny what I implied, which she didn't dare do, or sit trembling while everyone else began to wonder. For years, I had been the one sitting in silence while comparisons were drawn, while praise was heaped on my sister and I was left with scraps, but now the silence belonged to them, and it was heavier, more suffocating, because it was filled with questions they couldn't bring themselves to ask out loud. When the evening ended and relatives began filing out, I caught my sister gripping Mom's arm a little too tightly, her smile brittle as she reassured everyone that everything was under control. And I thought to myself how quickly control can evaporate when even a single stone is thrown into water that has been carefully kept still for decades. I didn't need to shout, I didn't need to confront, I just needed to let them see that I was no longer afraid of speaking, and in that realization, I understood that my revenge was not going to be about a single outburst, but about letting them slowly unravel under the weight of their own fear. And as I left the house that night, the cool air hitting me with a strange sense of finality, I knew that the next step would be the one that would leave no doubt, the one that would make even my sister, who had always been so certain of her place above me, realize that she was standing on ground far less stable than she ever believed. In the days that followed the dinner, the atmosphere around my family shifted in a way that was almost impossible to ignore, because every conversation seemed to carry an undertone of suspicion, every glance felt heavy with unspoken questions, and every silence grew longer than it should have, as if everyone was waiting for something to finally break. My sister called me more often than she ever had before, not to boast about her achievements or to casually dismiss mine, but to ask where I was, what I had heard, whether I had noticed any changes in Mom. And though she tried to make these questions sound like routine concern, I could hear the edge in her voice, the edge of someone who was no longer certain she was standing on solid ground. My mother, on the other hand, kept her distance, speaking only when she had to, and when she did, her voice was quieter, more careful, as though every word might expose more than she intended, and it was in those pauses, those careful silences, that I realized I had already won more than I expected simply by saying so little. The final blow, however, didn't come in the form of an argument or some grand confrontation, because that would have been too obvious, too loud, and not nearly as satisfying as watching them unravel under the pressure of doubt. Instead, it came when I decided to put into motion something I had considered for years, but never dared to act on, sharing just enough of what I knew with someone outside the immediate circle, someone who would let the whisper spread without it ever being traced directly back to me. I reached out to an aunt, one who had always been polite to me but never particularly close, and I told her in a low, deliberate voice that sometimes the things my mother preached about honesty and image weren't as straightforward as she liked to make them seem, and that maybe the tremors everyone had seen were not simply medical, but the kind of guilt that sits in a body for too long. I didn't have to elaborate, I didn't have to name specifics, because the beauty of suggestion is that it allows the listener to fill in the details with their own imagination, and I knew she would, and I knew she would repeat it, not maliciously but because she couldn't help herself. And soon enough the family would begin to question the woman who had once positioned herself as untouchable. When my sister found out that relatives were asking questions she couldn't answer, she called me late at night, her voice shaking in a way I had never heard before, and demanded to know what I had said, who I had talked to, why people were suddenly doubting Mom's spotless image. I let her rant for a while, let her spill out all the panic she had tried to hold back, and when she finally paused to catch her breath, I told her calmly that I didn't owe her an explanation, not after years of being treated like I was invisible. Not after every dinner where I had been cut down to nothing while she sat on her throne. She tried to argue, to regain control, but her words collapsed under the weight of her desperation, and in that moment, I knew there was nothing left of the certainty she had always carried, nothing left of the superiority she had wielded so easily. Because she was begging me for clarity, and I wasn't about to give it to her. Mom eventually called too, her voice low and trembling not from her hands this time but from the fear of exposure, and she asked me directly what I intended to do. I told her that I didn't intend to do anything except stop protecting the image she had worked so hard to build at my expense, that if the truth about the past began to seep through, then maybe it was simply time for her to live with the same vulnerability she had forced on me for years. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that speaks louder than words, and I knew she understood that she no longer had the power to put me back in my place. The real satisfaction didn't come from watching them panic, though that was part of it, but from realizing that I no longer felt small in their presence, no longer felt the need to justify myself or compete in a game that had been rigged from the start. I had taken back my power not by screaming, not by fighting, but by letting them destroy themselves with their own fear, their own doubt, their own unraveling. And when my sister called again, this time in tears, telling me that Mom's health was declining faster and that people were starting to whisper openly about things she couldn't control, I simply told her that maybe she should handle it, since she was, after all, the accomplished one, the one who could supposedly manage everything. As I hung up the phone, I felt a sense of closure that was not neat or perfect, but strong enough to settle something in me that had been unsettled for decades, and I understood that revenge is not always about fire or explosions. Sometimes it is about patience, silence, and the slow erosion of a facade until the people who once looked down on you are left standing in the rubble of their own lies. I didn't need to tell the world every detail of what I knew, because the damage had already been done, and the brilliance of it was that I had finally turned the tables without ever stepping outside the lines they themselves had drawn. And so the girl who was told she would never be as beautiful or as accomplished as her sister finally walked away not only equal but victorious, not because I became what they wanted me to be, but because I proved that even the quietest one at the table can end up holding all the power when the moment comes.